Hello, this is Grant Rio. Today I would like to talk about an indie horror experimental game, Anatomy, developed by Kitty Horrowshow, an independent video game developer. This video might contain spoilers about the game, so I strongly suggest anyone who does not want to be spoiled, go ahead and try the game. It is on kittyhorrorshow.itch.io/anatomy. Also, if you like this video, please do not forget to like, subscribe, and leave your comments below. Please enjoy. The game Anatomy is a 3D first-person game in an empty dark house, where the player's main task is to simply collect voice tapes in different rooms and to play the tapes in a VCR in order to progress further. The voice in the tapes initially draws an analogy between human body and the house, describing each room as a functioning component of a body.
The dominant space of a house is ground level, as well as typically the center of activity in a well-populated home. The living room is very much the heart of the house. While a human heart circulates blood to oxygenate the body's extremities, the living room circulates people, activity, communication.
Initially, collecting the tapes is the only component of the game, but the program eventually glitches and closes itself. When reopened, the house has changed radically, with increased static on the game screen and audio distortion occurring. The house continues to degrade more and present more glitches as the player continues to play the game. So why is this game worth discussing? At the start of this video, I called this game a horror experimental game. Actually, a quite successful one. Well, before I talk about why I think it is successful, we need to first define what is an experimental game. Quoting from game designer Patrick Jagoda in his book Experimental Games Critique Play and Design in the Age of Gamification, games are experimental in terms of how they encourage provoked observation that takes place in both the design and the gameplay phases. The book further illustrates that in design, experimentation takes place through development, playtesting, and iteration. In gameplay, players experiment through a variety of actions, including the formation of strategy, exploration of the possibility space, and exploitation of the game's affordances through metagaming practices. Let's first follow this definition and talk about the experimentation on the game player's side. Indeed, according to Jagoda, players gain knowledge about games through experimenting, pushing different buttons physically or making different choices narratively, and thus form specific strategies against specific enemies. This is especially true for the horror genre games, since under most cases, there exists some dangerous creature or power that pose potential threat to the virtual character controlled by the player. It is necessary for the player to gain knowledge about how to hide from, to evade from, or to even battle against that dangerous existence. Yet, what about Anatomy? Without any interference, the doors in the house are all closed by default. The player is thus potentially encouraged to go to every door and try to open it. Every attempt is an experimentation because the player never knows what is behind the door, not even after 1 or 2 loops of the game. Open the door, you may find an empty room. A door behind the door. A glitchy room. Or even a room that locks you inside with no way out. Or the door is simply locked. There is no strategy formed, and the possibility space seems infinite. the player thus becomes extremely vulnerable under countless futile attempts to predict the upcoming events. Anatomy is thus a successful horror experimental game because its players are constantly experimenting. The game takes advantage of the unstopping experimentation process and turns it into a nightmare against the players, eliciting fear of unpredictability. Furthermore, such fear is projected into the real world due to the total abstraction of the game, which would be mentioned in the second part of this video. So what about the experimental aspect of the game from a game designer's perspective? Well, the other question we could ask is what innovative attempts did Game Anatomy make compared to other contemporary horror games? First and the most obvious one, the low resolution of images and 3D objects and a quite limited number of 3D assets. Simply, let's first Google images of horror games. As you can see, almost all pictures have well-designed models and realistic visual settings and character appearances. If we look at some popular horror games that come out together with Anatomy in 2016, like Five Nights at Freddy's Sister Location, Layers of Fear, Dead by Daylight, photorealism is always present, which helps to push the virtual world closer to the actual real world, such that the players are easier to immerse themselves into the game. Well, Anatomy does not agree with that. It throws away photorealism and embraces geometry and simplicity. The low resolution and low mesh 3D assets in the game manages to serve two important functions as a result of the designer's attempt. Firstly, the number of furniture in the rooms are so limited that each piece of furniture becomes a significant characteristic of that room, calling for more attention and even turns into an indicator of the room's emotion, quote unquote. For example, the living room is said to be the heart of the house, eliciting activity and communication. Among the only existing objects in the living room, the TV suddenly stands out, as it is the only object that the player could interact with. The TV thus becomes the dominant representative of the living room, a place for action and communication. As the player pays more attention to the TV, it delivers a message to the player. The emotion contained within the message is straightforward. It expresses a sense of loss, a sense of hatred. With no other visible creature in the house, the player is forced to believe that the emotion is expressed by this room, or combined with the narration from the cassette from the videotapes, the emotion might be expressed by the house itself. Secondly, the low-quality 3D assets make the rooms in the house less specific and more abstract. In other words, the living room in the game is not the living room, but a living room. The house as an entity is so abstract and unspecific that it becomes an idea that could be applied to any houses. The game thus manages to overextend itself across the virtual space into the physical space where the players are located. The fear towards the house is thus together projected into real-world houses, real-world living rooms, and real-world closed doors. Another innovative attempt by the game Anatomy is its extremely limited vision in darkness. Though most horror games introduce settings where the player has to move in a dark environment with constrained visibility, Anatomy takes advantage of darkness that no other game does. It is so dark in the game that the player has to walk by the walls to orient themselves in the room. By following the walls, the player relies on the house to navigate, which adds another layer of vulnerability because the house already shows itself as a conscious rejective existence that is not reliable. At the same time, the player still has the possibility of falling into total darkness, which leads to another interesting experimental result. While in a lot of horror house or haunted house games, where the players are constrained in a limited amount of space and are chased by certain creatures, Anatomy utilizes darkness to create almost an infinite imaginative space in a limited house environment. With nothing visible around, we lose a sense of spatial accuracy. Our imagination replaces our rationality. Anatomy shows all the other horror house games that a limited space where there is no escape might be scary, but an infinite space eliciting a sense of loss and helplessness creates another kind of dramatic effect. In addition to all the exciting experimental aspects of Anatomy from both the player's perspective and the designer's perspective, I would like to add a third dimension of experimentation, which is the free opening interpretation of the game. Throughout the whole game, the player never gets to know who is the protagonist. When we stand in front of the mirror, we see nothing. The game also offers limited context in terms of where is the house located, who built the house, who owns the house, and who was the one speaking in the videotape. Here, I would like to offer my own interpretation. The house in the contemporary capitalist world is often viewed as a property, as something that you can own. But the house in Anatomy holds its own consciousness and agency. If we follow the analogy that the house is the body, the alienated house corresponds to the alienated body of the laborers under a capitalist society. Anatomy thus could be seen as a critique of alienation. Of course, there could be totally different interpretations of the game, and a good experimental game induces thoughts and discussion. So what do you think? I would like to know your ideas and hear your voices. So here we are at the end of our video. I would like to thank my Professor Asterisk for sponsoring this video and letting this happen. Please do not forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment. I'm Grand Real, and I hope to see you in my next game video.